Welcome, brothers and sisters, and today, in no particular order, I discuss 3 ways that Proles could overthrow or cause the downfall of the party in George Orwell's 1984. Yet before we get into the meat of the matter, it's important to understand exactly why the party, particularly the inner party, does not believe a proletarian uprising is even possible. In the later scenes with O'Brien in 1984, the antagonist of the story dismisses the prospect of a proletarian revolt. Indeed, the general attitude of the party is one of indifference and disdain when it comes to the unwashed masses outside of their ranks. O'Brien's own attitude, though, is not baseless, and he believes that the proles cannot revolt simply due to the particular structure of society built to contain them. With the past in the control of the party, with all foreign powers blocked out, and with all information provided by the party, all of this combined with the artificial economic context maintained by the party and the siege mentality of the perpetual war renders the proles impotent, given that since they have no way to know they are oppressed, they simply have no reason to revolt. Throw into all of this the myriad distractions provided by the party, such as gambling, sports, movies, books and such, and the uneducated masses also have little time outside of their working hours to really even think, let alone question the nature of their society enough to revolt. Goldstein's book does state that revolutions generally come about when the so-called middle, the effective, educated middle class of the population, does the thinking for them and leads the revolution. However, with the outer party under tight control, this avenue of revolt too is indefinitely closed off. So how exactly is a proletarian uprising or prole-induced collapse possible given all of this? I have 3 particular scenarios. 2 of these are very plausible ones, and a third one is less probable, though still fun to think about and, in my estimation, law-proof. That is, perfectly reasonable to think about, even within Orwell's universe. So one plausible way the proles could be proved into a general uprising that brings down the party is through famine. However, it requires a particular and quite plausible set of circumstances to happen, which, by definition, would be out of the party's control or prediction. While O'Brien would arrogantly have us believe that the party does indeed control life at all levels, presumably including food production, even the most efficient of states cannot, by definition, account for so-called black swan events. Of course, given the peculiar societal and economic structure the party has constructed, if anything, the economy including food production is anything but optimal, and even a small unforeseen event, for example, such as a new strain of crop blight, could easily unbalance the system. If Oceania were to face large-scale crop failures through disease or environmental causes in any of their breadbasket regions, then the delicate system in which the masses are kept just above starvation level would cause mass riots and uprisings, and regardless of the government in place, and even under the iron-fisted INGSOC. Yes, I said would, not could. A common saying regarding such scenarios, even in our world, is that any society of any kind is only 9 miles away from anarchy. Oceania is particularly vulnerable in such a scenario, as the Ministry of Plenty, the party's economic branch of government, pushes inordinate amount of resources into the armed forces, and deliberately underproduces in order to help create the special conditions the party needs to thrive and survive. INGSOC as an ideology and the party itself can only maintain their grip on power indefinitely while a siege mentality is maintained, part of which is to artificially maintain an economy of perpetual shortage and hardship. Although the proles are also kept in check through control of the media, the altering of the past, and through having no knowledge of foreign lands, through all of which they could compare their material lives against other people's, the fact is that if enough of them are deprived of food, this would, without a doubt, tip them over the edge. People are people regardless of the state that rules them, and when ordinary men and women are starving and can't feed their kids, an uprising en masse is inevitable. While such an event is not guaranteed to overthrow the party necessarily, I wouldn't bet against it either, given the sheer numbers of proles compared to the party. The party, of course, is powerful, perhaps the most powerful state that has ever existed, but regardless of any mass executions, martial law and threats, it's not natural for starving people to just roll over in the face of effective democide when they're already faced with the slow and painful demise of starvation. Proles must also make up a large proportion of the guards recruited, as well as the civilian police, not mentioning yet most, if not all, the rank-and-file military personnel. While the party may indeed have had the foresight to hoard supplies to sustain such people during an emergency, will such ordinary folk, broadly unindoctrinated by party ideology, really just stand by and watch their loved ones at home starve? One method of mass dying that most of us will be familiar with, given relatively recent events, disease is another potential black swan event that even the most prepared government simply can't account for. In this scenario, however, the problem is not that the proles could be driven through desperation into the overthrowing of the party, but that enough of them die to make the system itself untenable, perhaps also causing a revolution of some kind as a result. Although the party look down on their effective slave population to the degree of not even regarding them as human beings, the inner party must be perfectly aware that they are still essential as workers and low-level enforcers. Every party member combined still only makes up about 15% of the oceanic population, far too few to effectively keep the food production, infrastructure and other systems vital for maintaining the party's rule functional, which is not even mentioning the fact until now that the party themselves have their own roles as the effective civil service and rulers of the society. This scenario is very plausible in that the pandemic would not even need to be that deadly to have a devastating effect that could lead to a similar pro-uprising in the first entry, or perhaps enough of an opening for a foreign conquest, or even, unthinkably, an outer-party rebellion. Taking out a large portion of the truck drivers, military personnel, factory or power plant workers could, for example, cause a domino effect that the party may find difficult to handle. Imagine a pandemic that kills 20% of the population and perhaps incapacitates a further 20% on top of that for a time. The effect on production in all sectors could be catastrophic and exceptionally difficult to overcome in the short term. This again is something all governments fear, and given how malnourished and weak the working population are compared to modern and even comparable contemporaneous societies in the real world, it's not hard to envision how a new strain of virus could easily take hold and sweep through the masses. This could have a knock-on effect that easily provokes the aforementioned riots and uprisings, with perhaps a few ambitious inner party members using the event to seize more power for themselves, or even a few outer party comrades seizing this once-in-a-century opportunity to lead a proletarian revolt and tear down the party once and for all. Finally, moving on to the least plausible scenario, given what we know about how the party and thought police operate, religion is actually one area that could develop into an existential threat if the party, especially the inner party, falls victim to its own hubris regarding the proles. If O'Brien's arrogant dismissal of the proletariat is reflective of his class in general, then there is a chance that something of a threat could emerge in this form. In an earlier video, I believe I have touched on BB and the cult of personality as taking on some of the trappings of a religion. However, this may be more inside of the party itself, among the more hopelessly indoctrinated comrades. Religion has, for better or worse, always been a feature of the human condition, and I see no special circumstances that prevent its growth within Oceania, though perhaps more likely in the deprived areas than in the cities. I think it's simplistic to think that all areas are uniformly bad to live in. As in our world, even in poorer nations, the cities will be marginally better for work and living conditions, while outside of these areas, the lives of the masses will be worse, while also being relatively isolated, less important, and, crucial here, unheeded. In Airstrip 1, we can see how bad the lives of the Proles are already, so imagine how much worse the Proles outside of the major cities have it. In such environments, it would not be perhaps surprising for dangerous religious movements to develop, perhaps around messianic figures, or even bizarrely perhaps around the person of Big Brother himself. An interesting parallel on the last scenario is the so-called Peasants' Revolt in the later 14th century Kingdom of England. While a very rough analogy, as the peasants were actually mostly well-to-do middle-class or upper working-class types, and the grievances were over tax, not religion. The point is that the King Richard II was not himself the target of the rebels, who actually allowed the King to leave the Tower of London and were, ultimately, even infamously disbanded by the King's own personal intervention. Perhaps similarly then, the religious fanatics in my little scenario could view BB very much like Richard II, BB merely being a victim of evil counsellors or underlings. Perhaps BB is the fount of all goodness and might, is merely not aware that his evil lieutenants are heretically subverting his orders. Unfortunately for those evil counsellors, it's likely no personal Richard II-like intervention would materialise in their case, given the likelihood that Big Brother himself is actually just a convenient fiction. A further dimension to this religious revolt on behalf of BB then could be conspiracy theories running amok that BB was assassinated or imprisoned, or perhaps darker still, there would be a truly violent reaction of the rebelling Proles to the reality of Big Brother's non-existence. Leaving this particular theorised scenario, we need only look back on our own history to see how mass religious movements can spiral into existential threats to the governing elite. The Taiping Rebellion of the mid-19th century was led by a man claiming to be the brother of Jesus Christ and took around 13 years to put down, while costing the lives of upwards of 30 million people. Of course, I'm aware that the Thought Police do have a few agents that always operate within the proletariat, and at least in theory, officially hunt, expose, and eliminate all Proles deemed genuine threats to the party's rule. However, even if we accept this, it's simply a matter of numbers and probabilities that, given enough time, as well as enough indifference and complacence, that one or two genuinely gifted Prole individuals may emerge as religious leaders. I deem this scenario as less likely than the first two, as the rise of a religious movement is something the party could feasibly squash if detected quickly enough. Even if, say, it grew rapidly, taking hold in a small region of a province, perhaps the party could muster a response and crush it in its infancy. However, if after a few centuries of party rule, the response was lax enough, then it's not impossible that such a movement could explode and rapidly spiral out of the party's control. The key to the development of any mass religious movement challenging the party would perhaps, at least in my flawed imagination, involve a class-oriented ideological bent to it, the better to keep it within the lower class. Luck would also be a factor. Could enough associates of the Thought Police be fooled, converted, or bribed to allow such a movement to breathe early on? It would have to be relatively secret too, at least to begin with, perhaps akin to early Christian communities in the Roman Empire, and gain a decent hold in the key enforcement arms of the state, especially the army and police. Interestingly, religion in principle is actually not banned in Oceania. Specifically, Prole worship, that is not outright banned, and the party would be happy to tolerate it if managed and made politically harmless. From what we can tell, the Proles seem largely uninterested in it. The bigger deal for the party is to keep the Proles apolitical, apart from their occasional participation in the mass rallies and executions against the foreign enemies of the time. So the foundations of any militant religion could, in theory, be developed under the very approving nose of the party, and perhaps backfire in the long run. Of the three scenarios, this is the most implausible, just given what I believe is the reach of the Thought Police. It's tempting to assume that just because relatively few full thought police agents operate among them, that this gives the masses a wide berth to develop dangerous political or religious movements. However, as I've touched upon in past videos, thought police agents likely have vast webs of associates in and out of the party that assist them and do 99% of the grunt work in investigating as well as arresting threats and enforcing the party's will. The difficulty for any mass religious movement then would be to survive long enough earlier on by avoiding the associates and spies of the thought police. It's unlikely, but it's not impossible. So those were my choices for 3 scenarios in which the Proles within the 1984 universe could revolt and cause or outright overthrow the party. But what do you think? Is the party even immune to Black Swan events? Would the party easily be able to stamp out a fervent religious movement earlier on? Write your thoughts and objections in the comments section, and if you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing and liking. Thank you, brothers and sisters, and remember, if there is hope, it lies in the Proles.